Hi, it's Dr. Saira Sabzaali, and I'm really excited to bring to you today this talk on attachment-based parenting. Let's get started. So by the end of this session, hopefully we will have achieved these things. We're going to do an intro to attachment theory, so introduction for those who just to figure out our terms and what we're talking about. Then we're going to be giving you ideas to connect with your children, curiosity about discipline techniques, and knowing when your child is in trouble. And if you look at this slide here, you'll see these different icons. So there's a light bulb, a puzzle piece, a check mark, and a lock. And throughout the presentation, you'll see in the top right-hand corner, whichever topic area the slide is about, you'll see that symbol in the corner. So you'll get it as we go along, but just to kind of keep you on track of what we're trying to do here, because sometimes in these presentations it can feel like a lot. I would encourage you, if you're watching and you're a note taker, this would be a great time to grab your journal or a pen, so that you can take notes as we go. Sometimes it's better, we just learn better sometimes if we're taking notes. Some people don't like to, that's okay too, but this would be the time to go grab your stuff as we move to attachment-based parenting. Let's start with the question, what is childhood? What is childhood? When we think about childhood, what kind of images come to mind? What kind of words come to mind when we think about children and childhood? Maybe things like freedom and happiness and playfulness. There's three particular words that I want to, or three particular ideas that I want to share with you around childhood. So the first picture here, you'll see jumping rope, right? And so that's about the sense of freedom, the sense of limitlessness, like I could achieve anything. So children go from not being able to do much to suddenly being able to do a lot in a very short period of time. And so, and if a child can continue to feel free, that encourages them to stay curious, that encourages them to take like reasonable risks, and it encourages their growth, their brain development as well. So freedom is a really important element of childhood. If you look here at the second image of this little girl, that is silliness, right? Silliness and play. Just the capacity to just do things for no good reason, to just like have a silly old time. And you know, when you see kids doing these kind of antics, it can actually be triggering for some adults when kids are acting childish or silly, because maybe you weren't allowed to act that way when you were a kid, or maybe you just need some peace and quiet. But being silly and playful is part of childhood. It's actually one of the ways that children learn, one of the big ways children learn is through play. And so we want to expect and encourage that silliness, that goofiness, that playfulness in children. The third image here is the other thing that's important for childhood, which is creativity, right? So, I mean, there's a picture here of a child painting. It doesn't have to be painting. It can be any sort of creativity, anything that they're like building or growing, something that where they had nothing and they made something, right? And that's really important because, again, it goes back to that sense of freedom, but also creativity strengthens the parts of the child's brain that in the future are going to be useful for decision making and useful for just long-term planning and thinking. And we'll get into a little bit of that as we go. So creativity, freedom, and playfulness, those are the three kind of key ingredients in childhood. And if you think about your own childhood, you might want to ask yourself, did it include those things? Or were there parts of your childhood where it didn't, right? Were there some sort of a change in the family, some sort of a stress in the family, where maybe you weren't allowed to be playful and silly, or maybe you didn't feel like you had freedom, or maybe you didn't have outlets for your creativity? But these three ingredients are really essential in ensuring that children develop. I mean, and there's probably like 100 more words we can use, but we just wanted to kind of keep it simple and say freedom, playfulness, and creativity, those three things. And I want to help you understand how those connect to attachment-based parenting. So what actually matters to kids? Like, what do they care about? Right? There's so many different opinions and perspectives about what matters to kids. And I'll often hear people say, oh, when I was a kid, we didn't do this or we did do that. And it can be confusing, like what actually matters to our kids. And so according to the research, there's just a few things that really matter to kids. Just a few things. And at the end, I'll show you some of the books that informed this project. And so you can, if you have more interest in it, you can go back and look through them. So you can see that we're talking about the first thing is connection with their loved ones. This is in no particular order, but connection with their loved ones is critical for children to feel like they have a place to land, a sense of belonging. So not only connection, but actually belonging. Being paid attention to by the adults and other children in their lives. See, if children are not paid attention to, they will find a reason for you to pay attention to them. And you know this, right? You know that when you want a child to participate in something and they're not getting their way, they will still get your attention somehow. Maybe not in the most positive form. And, you know, a lot of times with kids, we'll say, oh, she's just seeking attention, just ignore her. And that actually has the opposite effect. It actually has the opposite effect. When kids are seeking our attention, if we give them our attention, usually the whatever's going on really quickly minimizes and goes away. So they need attention. They need to be valued for who they are, not what they achieve. I'll say that again, to be valued for who they are, not what they achieve. There's certain ways of parenting that are much more focused on what children are achieving rather than who they are intrinsically. And those children grow up into perhaps high achievers, overachievers, but there's always this sense that I'm not good enough, right? And so when we value a child for who they are, for what they bring just as a being on the planet, it's much easier for them to develop self-esteem. And it's hard to do. I know my daughter is in an art class, and one of the things that the art teacher suggested to us is to not actually say, what a nice painting, right? Or that's so good. And it was confusing to me at first. And she explained to us, the parents, that these children are learning a skill. And so if you say it's good today, but then next week you don't say it's good, then they're looking for your stamp of approval more than actually focusing on learning the skill. And so she taught us to say things like, oh, I noticed you use a lot of different colors here, or I noticed that you're working on your shading, or isn't it neat how there's this figure in the foreground and that in the back, like whatever, but make specific observations rather than it's good or it's nice. And that will help the child with more constructive information and also not tie up your liking of the child with what they're doing. Really important. Children need to be able to have some personal wins. And personal wins specifically in areas that interest them. Not necessarily areas that you want them to be interested in, but areas that interest them. Children need, and you already know this, structure and clear expectations from reliable adults, with a little bit of room for flexibility. Right? So there's this, Barbara Coloroso talks about 3 kinds of families, and she talks about the brick wall family, the jellyfish family, and the backbone family. So the brick wall family is all about rules and structure and discipline, and it's my house and you do it my way, and there's a clear leader, and there's it's a punishment-based driven kind of approach to parenting. And many people have parented this way, and maybe their kids have turned out great, maybe. One of the challenges with brick wall parenting is it really, really stifles creativity and individuality, right? You have to conform. And so kids who grow up in brick wall families tend to be either super, super compliant and obedient. So they have a hard time with confrontation. They have a hard time saying no. And they're very like people pleasers. Or the opposite can happen where they actually kind of push back against authority and become really, really rebellious and everything's a fight, right? So brick wall parenting kind of produces that type of kid. Jellyfish families are families where there's no structure. Kids can do whatever they want and they're just like free to run the home. And kids from jellyfish families end up feeling very, very insecure because children need wise adults to let them know what's okay and what's not okay. They need that. Without that, they actually don't thrive. And so jellyfish children tend to grow up to either be super, super rigid to compensate for the lack of structure when they were little, or just completely insecure and always kind of like pushing boundaries and not quite sure how to connect and how to kind of stay within a container. And then there's the backbone family, which is there's flexibility, there's room to move, and there's a clear structure as well. So those are the kinds of families where you'll have like a family meeting, right, to talk about something. Those are the kinds of families that value togetherness time. Those are the kinds of families where the children have a voice. They're not the main voice. Parents are the main voice, but the children have a chance to contribute their thoughts and their opinions to what's going on. So those are the three kinds of families. And in order to kind of have the ideal movement and creativity and play and freedom for children, we want to try to be as best as we can flexible. So structure with flexibility. Children also need unsupervised playtime. They need playtime where there's no grown-ups around. So both on their own, so being able to play alone by themselves, as well as playing with other kids without being monitored, right? Otherwise, play can sometimes become performative. And what we want play to be is just something with not any necessary outcome. So there's a difference between structured outcome-based play and free play. And what children need is free play. They can enjoy the other kind of play, but they need free play where there's imagination, where, a stick has turned into a wand and suddenly something is happening, right? Rather than like, let's play Monopoly. That's important too, but that can't be the only way that children play, because they need to be able to develop their own way of seeing the world, and that happens through play. Play is so exciting for me because if you watch your child playing, you will start to see a story emerging. You'll start to see what's interesting to them, what's valuable to them, how their mind works, whether they're articulating or not. So my son, when he was little, I'll say like 3 to 7 or so, loved Lego. I mean, he still loves Lego, but he got really into Lego at that age. And he wouldn't speak much about what was happening with the characters, but he would build things and make sounds, right? And so I would ask him about the things he's built. And so I remember it so clearly, one thing that he built was this van, and it had like 12 people in the van, right? And I asked him about that. I said, oh, how come there's so many people in the van? And he said, because it's a big family and they like having a big family. And that was just around the time that we had moved away from our extended family and we were really isolated, just the three of us. And so he somehow in his mind was making sense of that, right? Was making sense that like, okay, so we're not with the big family, but it told me that that was something he was going through. He could not have articulated that, right? My daughter never played really with, sometimes, but Lego wasn't really her thing. She would do more this like acting out thing with characters or dolls, and the dolls are talking to each other. And one of the things that came out in her play was how much she was missing a playmate, kind of a best friend, right? And because that would come out a lot in the single character always looking for a friend in the way that she was playing. And I didn't necessarily participate. I just kind of watched and observed. It's great if you can participate, but that unsupervised playtime where they're just left to do their thing can be so relaxing for children. So they need that. What they need, I don't know if I'd say most of all, but what they really, 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 really need is happy, real parents. And it's happy and real because we understand you're not going to be happy all the time, right? Happiness comes and it goes, just like sadness comes and it goes. But to be real, to show up for your children authentically, not with a mask on. And a great example of this is when parents will say, if you're upset about something and your child asks you, what's the matter? Are you upset? And you say, no, I'm fine. Everything's fine. So what that does is it makes the child then question their own understanding of emotion, right? Because they're seeing something about you that leads them to believe something's wrong, and then you tell them nothing's wrong. And so they'll believe you, but they'll doubt themselves. And so another way of doing that, to be more real with our kids, we might say something like, oh yeah, I'm not doing too well today, but I'll be okay. And you didn't do anything wrong. That kids always have to, if we don't tell kids, they will assume that we're upset because of them. It's the funniest thing. And it's not like, it's just every child just expects that I've done something wrong and that's why my parents are unhappy. So it's good to reassure them that it's not you, but to be honest with them when you're not okay. So it helps them like see role modeled what it looks like to be sad, what it looks like to be angry, what it looks like to be frustrated, what it looks like to be lonely, right? And not have to always feel like they always have to be a certain way because their parents, people will say, I've never seen my dad cry, right? Like, okay, but maybe have you seen him sad, right? Have you been able to see that sadness for men is a thing? Or was there just never that expression in your home? So we have to think about that when we're raising. So these are the things that matter the most to kids. And in the context of attachment parenting, so let's go back here. Not attachment parenting. So I want to let you know there's a difference between attachment theory and attachment parenting. So what we're talking about is attachment-based parenting, which means we're using attachment theory and we're kind of extrapolating some ideas for parenting. There's some people who have actually a style of parenting called attachment parenting. That's something different. That's like, they're using the research in a particular way. We're not talking about that per se. We're talking about parenting that is rooted in bonding and connection. That's what attachment is about. Attachment theory is about bonding and connection and how children relate to their primary caregivers and how that prepares them for the world. So what we're going to do now is we're going to watch a short video clip, and then I'll come back, we'll talk about it, and then we'll watch another clip, and we'll take it from there. So what did you think of that video? Isn't it interesting that when we're learning about parenting, we kind of end up thinking about our own childhood as well, right? And of course, because that's where we learned to be parents. We learned to be parents by watching our parents. Most of us didn't get a manual. I know I didn't, right? So it's like, okay, this is what other people did, and maybe I can emulate that, or maybe I can try for the opposite of that. And neither of those is a really good strategy, right? Because if you do exactly what they did, well, there's probably flaws in how they did it. And if you do the opposite of what they did, you're just reacting rather than realizing there's all these other ways to interact with our children. And authenticity, if you think about yourself and the places where you might have put aside parts of yourself because the family just wasn't able to hold it for you. It's just something to think about. If we could allow our children to be real, we could allow them to be themselves, then we become that real landing place for them, right? And it doesn't mean that you tolerate bad behavior. So one of the things I say to my daughter is I say, you can be angry, but you can't be mean, right? So we allow them to express how they're doing within the parameters of like you don't want your children swearing at you and things like that. But they can be mad, and you can stay with them while they're angry. One of the things that, like kind of the old messaging to parents was the timeout or the go to your room. And what happens, like you watch in the video, is that you're left then to just figure it out on your own. What a child brain needs is an adult brain that is steady to get their physiology back to where it needs to be, to calm them down. And so your steady presence and support makes them know that, okay, I'll be okay eventually. One of the things that I would say to my kids is, when you're ready, I'm here to help you feel better. And I'll teach you some strategies near the end about how to get our children out of those zones of intensity. So let's watch the next video. This one's really interesting because it talks about the stages that children go through in healthy attachment and how healthy attachment looks as a child grows. So Dr. Gordon Neufeld is actually one of the people who really informs my understanding of attachment theory, the modern kind of speaker writer, as well as Dr. Gabor Mate that you saw before. His work is around trauma and addiction. So looking kind of back at what are some of the root causes, where did people come from that ends them in addiction and trauma as adults. So those are kind of their backgrounds. I thought I might just share with you kind of the summary of the stages of closeness that Dr. Neufeld talked about. So he started with being with, right? Like knowing that we're together, like just being physically together. And that's why we talk a lot about like having your babies close by, right? Being near. In the wild, if the baby was somewhere else, it would get eaten by the tiger, right? So babies have actually developed physiologically to ensure that there's an adult around. And if there isn't an adult around, to ask for the adult. How do babies ask? They cry. So when your baby's crying, it's natural, it's important, it's biological. They need closeness. They need to be with you. That will help their brain development, because otherwise their brain is in the process of seeking and worrying, and their whole all their energy is going into that activation and that fight or flight mode rather than into growing and learning. And so when babies are near their caregivers, it's easier for them to grow and learn. So being with is the first one. Then there's being like, that thing about, oh, your toes look just like mine do, or, we have the same smile. There's an age where children, especially girls, it seems, like to dress up like their moms, like matching outfits, right? So being like is important. It gives them a sense of identity, and that there's another who's invested in them and like them. And then there's belonging to, right? So it's one thing to be like someone, but it's another thing when they collect you, when you belong to them, when you feel that kind of magnetism, like they want you closer and you're part of the circle. And that's the belonging to. And then not just belonging, but mattering, right? Sometimes in families, we've got the belonging stuff down, but we don't always have the mattering stuff, because sometimes things kids talk about feel so like ridiculously unimportant. Like, what? But it matters to them. And so if you can take an interest in the things that matter to them, then they feel like they matter to you. Okay, let me say that again. If you can take an interest, even a superficial interest, about the things that matter to them, they feel like they matter to you. And so letting children know they matter, one of the ways, like I said, is taking an interest in what matters to them. Another way is to let them know, you're really important to me. I'm really lucky to have you in my life, right? To verbalize these things. If we don't verbalize, children will kind of make a story on their own. So many people I've worked with over the years who their parents very rarely said, I love you. And as children, they weren't quite sure. Like, did they? Of course, your parents, most likely, right? Even in really difficult circumstances, parents tend to love their children, but that a child wouldn't know that because they've never been told, right? Maybe you're showing them in lots of ways, but that verbalization is really important. We want them to know that they matter. Once they've got that being with, being like, belonging to, mattering to, then there's room for emotional intimacy where they want to kind of share their feelings with you. They feel comfortable to share their feelings. And as I mentioned before, you kind of have to be okay with holding their feelings, right? For those of us who didn't have a chance to do that as children, it can be triggering. It can be upsetting when your child is crying or acting out. And the temptation will be like to get away or to get them away. But what they are trying to do is share their feelings with you. And if you can stay for that, then what they learn is, even if you feel bad, I'm still here for you. Even if you feel bad, I'm still here for you. How many of us as adults actually feel like we often have to put on a mask and be fine because we're worried about showing people that we're struggling? Right? Where does that come from? That comes from our childhood, where we weren't allowed to have all of those darker parts of us show up because will we be loved? Will we be liked? Will we belong? Will we matter? And then finally, psychological intimacy. This is where children want to tell you about their lives. They want to include you in their lives. And so you might be sitting here listening and thinking, okay, but my child is now 8 and I missed some of that. So now what do we do? Like, what do I do to build? You can start at any time. One of my teachers, Dr. Chuck Spezzano, he says, it's never too late to have a happy childhood. Never too late to have a happy childhood. You can start again. You can find ways to be with your child, to show them that they're like you, that they belong to you, that they matter to you, whatever age they're at. So these, what Dr. Gordon Neufeld was talking about is developmentally, these are the ages, but you can redo it at any point, any point. So the next thing I want to tell you about is some strategies in supporting our children. So, I've mentioned the meltdown. What we're trying to help our children do is self-regulate, right? And we either self-regulate by letting the emotion kind of run its course, or we self-regulate by supporting our children so that it can be shorter. So if we let things run their course, children could like cry and cry and cry and cry for like sometimes an hour, like long periods of time. Why does that happen? Because they're not supported and they don't have any way to calm themselves down, right? They just don't have that in their brain yet, the ability. So our job as parents is to help them get back to balance. So there's two tools that I want to share with you. And I put this around like rethinking discipline, right? When we think about the word discipline, we might think of punishment. Like that's kind of the first connection. It's like, I have to discipline my child. I have to punish them for something they're doing wrong. But the way that these two authors and others talk about discipline is actually about helping your child come back to who they were meant, who they're supposed to be, right? So they've kind of gone off track, and discipline is bringing them back to track. That's the point. That's the purpose of discipline, is to bring your child back to the path that is best for them. Because there are some things that you just know are best for them, right? Like maybe they don't want to go to school, but they have to learn certain things, right? You want them to be able to read. So there's certain things that you know are best for them. And then you can kind of wiggle around and see how to do that. That's discipline. What if we thought of discipline in that way, bringing my child back on track, rather than punishing them for something they did wrong? Imagine as an adult, if your supervisor, say you made a mistake, say you were submitting some sort of a report and there was some really big error that you made in that, right? Imagine your supervisor cut your pay because of that, right? What message would that send to you about the relationship that you have with your supervisor? Versus if your supervisor came to you and said, oh, look, this thing you did wasn't correct, and this is the way to kind of get back and fix it. What message would that give you about your supervisor, right? So when punishment actually creates distance between ourselves and our child. But discipline brings us closer, okay? So here's two tools. So one is the birthday cake and one is the traffic light. So the birthday cake, this is good for kids up to age about 8, 9 or so. They'll go along with this one. And this is the candles. So most kids know about blowing out birthday candles. And so when the child is like really either like they're angry and they don't want to talk about it, or they're like really in a big state, then you'd say, blow out the candles, and you put up your 10 fingers and you wiggle them, and then you get the child to blow, and they go, right? Or they might go, like, oh, that's not strong enough. Now, what are we doing here? We're introducing play to solve a problem. Rather than matching them in their aggression and their intensity, we go into play. So candles, and then they blow them. Oh, there's one. Still some left. You get them to start blowing out the candles. You might even want to help them with some of the candles, but you're getting them to blow out the candles. What are they doing? They're actually taking deep belly breaths, which helps regulate their brain out of the fight or flight mode, back into neutral. Deep breaths, that's what does it. If you tell your child, take deep breaths, they won't do it, they won't know what that means, but if you tell them to blow out the candles, they'll get it, right? And one of the ways to teach children this is to actually have yourself demonstrate it, right? So you can say something like, oh, I'm feeling really upset. Can you put up your candles? Put up your candles for me so I can blow them out. And then you blow out the candles and show them what it looks like. The younger they are, the more they need that role modeling. By like 5 or 6, they know how to do it. But maybe 3, 4, they might not quite get what you're trying to do. So blow out the candles. That's one. The second one is the traffic light. So this is a really excellent one for younger children under 5 when they're trying to kind of navigate big feelings and they don't really know how to. Clearly, they're not very good at it because you're just like, what is wrong with this child? So there's red. So the way that it was taught to me is you do this part together. This is part of the play and the creativity. Is you design a traffic light, and so the way that you do that is you take 3 big pieces of paper. You can cut them into circles if you want, and then paint or color those circles with your child. Okay, and tell them we're working on something really exciting, right? And so kind of pump it up. Then you stick the circles on the wall, one on top of the other, like a traffic light, red, yellow, green. And if you can get yourself some like clothespins, or like clothespins is usually the easiest, and you write each family member's name on one clothespin. So you write like mom, dad, their name, their sibling's name, something like that, right? You write all the names. And then what you do is you put all of the clothespins at the bottom, just kind of like this way on the green circle. Now, what this is it's an indicator of the emotions of any particular person. So the way that you start with this is you teach, it's simple. Red is angry, yellow is less angry, and green is okay, right? So it's like intense, not so bad. And they might be angry, they might be sad, but whatever that intense emotion is. I know for my daughter, anger was the big one. For my son, sadness was the big one, right? So when there's a big emotion. So what happens is the child is really worked up, and what we're going to try to get them to do is get to the point where they can take their pin and put it on the red. In order to get them there, we start with demonstrating, role modeling, and so you might genuinely, not just, don't make it up. If you're genuinely frustrated about something, irritated about something, angry about something, you would say to your child, so I would say, oh, I'm so angry right now. Can you go put me on red? And so they take your clothespin and they put you on red. If they're noticing their sibling is really, really upset, they take their clothespin and put them on red. So this child is now learning. If you have kids around the same age, they could each do their own clothespin. But if there's one that's significantly younger or older, then let them do it themselves. You put them on the thing. Let them do everybody's. Basically, the child that you want to teach about feelings should be the one that's doing this. And what they're learning is to look at the clues, the facial expression, the tone of voice, the energy of a person, and say, oh, they're feeling really riled up right now. They're in an intense emotion. And then as they start calming down, they can move to the yellow. And as they're feeling okay, they move to the green. One of the benefits of the traffic light is that you can use that language then outside the home too, right? You can say, ooh, looks like you're getting into the yellow. What do we need to do to get you back to the green? Right? So you're teaching children to catch it before it gets too big. Now, there's adults who can't even do that. I recognize that. And I'll tell you, my husband and I learned so much about ourselves from that traffic light. So it's for the whole family. Everybody will learn how to emotionally regulate a little bit more effectively. Okay, so the candles and the traffic light, some tools for you. I want to talk to you for a little bit about the power of play. So I've kind of alluded to this a little bit, but there's entire courses you can take on the power of play. One of the things about play that I mentioned earlier is that you can learn a lot from your child by their playing. Now, if they're playing alone, you'll kind of observe some things. But children really want to play with you. They actually do. They want to play with you, and you might find it so boring and so non-engaging, but it's you they want. They want to be with you. So if there's a way that you can play with your kids, and it doesn't have to be long. This example, I was talking to someone a while ago, and they were, she was trying to cook her meal, and her child was pulling on her, mommy, 3-4 years old. And so she didn't know what to do. And so I suggested to her, what about if you play with her, let her be play. So what happened was she brought her child's little kitchen stuff near the kitchen, and first, before she started cooking, she would actually play with her daughter and cook with her daughter. And then she would go to cooking on her own, and sometimes the daughter joined her, sometimes she didn't, but that dedicated 5, 7, 10 minutes of time with her child was all she needed. When a child is doing that, it's because they need your attention. And if you can give them your focused attention just for a short time in a playful way, their tank is full. And then they'll leave you alone to do your thing. And you might have to do that several times in a day. That's okay. Because eventually they'll know that when they need you, you're there. right? They don't have to like whine and like really try to get your attention. You're just going to show up for them and play. Play is also just fun. And I think adults, we don't have enough fun. So we just let yourself be childlike and play with your kid. They need it, and you will maybe enjoy part of it. So now what, right? You've watched this presentation, you're inspired, you have some new ideas, but what are you going to do about it? Like, how is it going to actually translate into your day-to-day life? So here's some ideas about how you might take some next steps. Number one would be to explore your own childhood and attachments. We tend to, like I said, either replicate or do the opposite of what happened for us as children, and neither of those is necessarily the way that you want to be parenting. There's a range in the middle. So when you explore your own childhood and your own attachments, it'll help you see what you might do a little bit differently with your child, or what you might actually like, oh, that worked, and I'm going to kind of take a little bit of that. When we just look down, we're not honest and conscious about what we inherited, right? They talk about intergenerational trauma. We inherit things from our parents. We inherit beliefs, ways of being. Even some of us inherit phrases. Like sometimes I hear myself talking like, oh, that's my mom, right? We inherit. So when we know ourselves and we know where we were coming from, it'll make it easier. So that's number one, is explore your own childhood. The next is I would really encourage you to rethink the purpose of discipline, and try to take some time to manage your own stress, right? Managing your parental stress. Because have you noticed, I've noticed that when I'm rushing, I'm much more short-tempered than when I have lots of time. And one of the reasons I'm rushing is because there's too many things to do. And so one of the things we've done in our family is we've minimized a lot of the stuff, a lot of the extras, so that we have more unscheduled, open family time together. They'll do all the activities eventually, right? But at this tender age, like from like 3 to 10, 11, this is the time that they can really get a lot from the family, a lot from the family. And so, sure, have them in one or two things, but we're overscheduling our children. So manage your own stress and rethink the purpose of discipline. The next one is to put yourself in their bodies. Remember, they're not able to regulate their emotion yet. They don't have the neural connections. They don't have the firing that's happening in yours and my brain. They just don't have it. So you're providing it for them. Imagine what it feels like to be just so out of control and not know what to do, how to fix it. Right? And you may think back to a time in your life maybe where you were grieving, right? And the feelings just felt so big and you just didn't know how to fix it. Now imagine that's happening like 6, 7 times a day for a child. So when you put yourself in their bodies, you can remember that they need your body, your presence, your stillness in order to get back aligned. Another really important one is for you to develop healthy adult attachments. So you feel like you're supported. Otherwise, what we do is we try to bond with our children, right? What we need to do, we need to bond with our children as their parents, but our children aren't supposed to give us something, okay? Parenting is this way, where we are giving to our children. It's nice, like we get some love but their responsibility is not for us to feel okay about ourselves. That's not their responsibility. That's our responsibility. And, creating adult relationships, friendships, relationship with your partner. If you're unhappy with the other parent, your children will feel that and they'll have a hard time with that. So those healthy adult attachments are so important. It doesn't seem like it maybe at the time, but that will help you, which in turn helps them. And finally, as I've been saying, role modeling those healthy interactions, right? Role modeling those healthy interactions, the tools to manage, and a safe place to feel. So letting yourself have feelings and making sure you're supported and your kids see that. So that's your homework. Just lots to do, but it's worth it. I want to end here and tell you a little bit about some of the books for those who might want to learn a little bit more, do a little bit more of a dive. So the first one is by Mary Sheedy Kurchinka, and that's Raising Your Spirited Child. I found that really helpful with my daughter, who had a really like feisty energy, right? My son was very kind of quiet and obedient, and she was feisty. And a friend of mine recommended this book, and it totally changed my perspective on what she's experiencing as a child and how to give her structure without breaking her spirit. Right? Because people, like children, need to learn how to live in a society. You also don't want to break their spirit. So that's the first one, Raising Your Spirited Child. The second one is The Conscious Parent. That's by Saira Sabzaali. And she there talks about kind of a spiritual approach to parenting. That if this is truly a soul that's come as a gift, what is our commitment and obligation as caretakers of that soul, right? Not owners, but caretakers. And how do we launch our children in a way that's not just about our own agenda, but about their soul calling? So that's The Conscious Parent. The Spiritual Child by Dr. Lisa Miller. That is really, really fascinating research about spirituality and childhood and the connection. A lot of times that sort of research gets like relegated to kind of the vague journals that nobody reads. So she's brought it all together in one place. So just to understand how to ensure that your child has is also on a spiritual path and understanding spirituality at different ages of development. It's a bit academic, so it is kind of a harder read. But if you're kind of a researcher, that's a good one. Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers. This is a groundbreaking book because it's seeing family attachments as the most important attachments. And going back to the way that societies were many, many, many generations ago, right? That we actually bonded with adults before we bonded with children because adults were the right people to learn from, not other children, right? You can't have an 8-year-old guiding a 6-year-old because they'll be coming at it from an 8-year-old's perspective. You need an adult guiding a 6-year-old. And so it gives, and it's really practical, lots of good ideas, really easy to read. So for those who are feeling like my kids are slipping away, that's a great read. And the last one is by John Gray. He was the one who did Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And this one is Children Are From Heaven. So hopefully those are some interesting reads for you. Hopefully we covered the things that we said we would talk about. A little bit about attachment theory. You have some ideas to connect with your children. Play. You're curious about the discipline techniques that you use. Remember, discipline isn't about techniques. It's about the bond. Restoring the bond, coming back to the bond, and getting them back on track. And knowing when your child is in trouble, right? Your child will be in trouble when there's those big kind of things going on, or they're totally disconnected and shut down from you. And hopefully you got some of that information throughout our presentation. And all the best. And parenting is hard, but you can do this.